It's my pleasure to welcome you at the Politaev Institute for Theoretical and Historical Studies in the Humanities seminar. We're happy to see you here and to host a wonderful talk by Professor Eklof and Professor Saburova in search of authenticity, populist ethics and the Soviet Intelligentsia. Professor Eklof is a Chief Researcher Fellow here at the Politaev Institute and Professor Emeritus of the Department of History at Indiana University, and Professor Tatiana Saburova is a lecturer of the same department and also an academic director of the Russian Studies Workshop in Indiana. Not only Professor Eklof, but also Tatiana Anatolievna worked for several years in our institute on a few projects that were both productive and thought-provoking, and we're continuing to collaborate with you. So it's especially interesting for us and pleasant to host this talk today. Right after the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask short questions to clarify details. And then we will have some time for longer comments and answers. And so now I'm turning the floor over to Professor Eklof and Tatiana Anatolievna. Thank you.
So I'll start. I wanted to say that it's not always the easiest case to share a presentation, but we wanted to make this as informal as possible. And the very fact that both of us are presenting is also indicative of kind of two somewhat different traditions of historiography, of course. But the very fact that we are doing it, we also see as indicative that it doesn't make an awful lot of sense about talking about Western and Russian historiography separately. And one of the pleasures of working together and translating was that we had to think very hard about the meaning of words like authenticity in two different languages. And so we'll come back to that. So our focus today is on populism and ethical rationalism, and we hope that fits into the kind of this year's annual theme in the Higher School of Economics, and particularly in ИГИТИ. So just briefly, why over the last century has populism emerged as a very highly debated topic at different intervals in the 19th and 20th century, first within the revolutionary movement itself, but also among scholars and even occasionally the public. There were debates within the populist movement itself as it emerged in the 1870s. There were debates during the 1920s when the new Soviet state began to write the first triumphalist histories of the revolutionary movement. And populists were treated first as predecessors of Marxism, then in 1936 as enemies of Marxism. The debate was renewed during the Thaw era under Khrushchev, and then pushed back again to the margins of historiography. And populists could be written about, but only when described as rationalism. Then finally in the Perestroika era, as both professional historians and much of the educated public began to re-examine their history from top to bottom, the questions of alternative socialisms and authentic democracy came to the fore. So we chose the life of what historians call a second tier, not the most prominent, not entirely obscure populist and his generation to examine this question and the debate, particularly about whether or not he was a genuine revolutionary. This all took place in the provincial city of Kirov or Viatka in 1988, whether or not a memorial plaque should be placed on his home. Nina Andreevna wrote her controversial manifesto, and I was gonna give it in Russian, but Tatiana told me to do it in English because my pronunciation is better. That is, I cannot forsake my principles. And and we wanted to find out about the mindset of the participants in this debate in Kirov. What was at stake in their minds? Why the appeal of populism to people in different walks of life? And in so doing, we had to ask ourselves what was at the core of populism, both imagined and real. Tatiana?
Yeah, and thank you so much for hosting us today, and thank you for organizing this event, because we are really happy to share what we found out in our research on Russian populism. But once again, I want to emphasize that it's not just about Russian populism, because we are trying to connect the history of the Russian intelligentsia of the late 19th century and over the course of the 20th century, emphasizing different time periods, and see what was in common and why populist revolutionaries were so appealing for the Soviet intelligentsia in the 1960s, in the 1970s, or in perestroika time, or what actually made Charushin, one of our main characters in our book, so controversial, but also put him in the center of debates, and different people participated in these debates. I mean, professional historians or local amateur historians like Kraevedi, and also just general public being involved in this debate over legacy of populism. What actually did this relevant, and why it became such a debatable question. So turning just to brief comments, because we wrote the whole book about Charushin, but of course we are not going to retell the whole biography. I just want to say that he was, as Ben mentioned, a second-tier revolutionary, a member of Tchaikovsky's circle, and kind of belonged to the generation of the 1870s. And we can talk about the beginning of Russian populism, one of the stages in the development, political development of Russian populism. But I also want to emphasize that it wasn't just an individual biography, because we usually argued about this, because I said we could use Charushin case as a lens, as a window in the history of Russian populism and the history of the generation of the 70s in the 19th century. But because we also tried to connect this biographical approach, this broader topic or broader approach, and write not just an individual biography, but to write a collective biography. And for this reason, actually, we deployed some tools of memory studies and generational studies, trying to see beyond just one life experience, but research and see what was in common and what kind of values, what ethics, what ideas actually united, and also became this common ground for this generational identity, but also political identity, and how, looking at this collective biography of the generation of the 70s, we can understand better the history of Russian populism, but also the history of the Soviet intelligentsia in the 20th century.
Okay, great. So one of the other things before I turn to this next little section is that what we discovered in reading these memoirs, a large number of memoirs, very noticeable that they, in their accounts of their lives, they almost always stopped with their release from exile or imprisonment in the 1890s. Most of them, however, returned to Russia. When they had been imprisoned and then exiled, something Tatiana once pointed out to me, that they were mostly 20, 21 years, 22 years in age, and they really hadn't gained a full identity as adults even, or they certainly hadn't gained a profession. And when they returned, however, after exile, most of them became very active in civil society in one way or another, the emerging civil society, as journalists, as educators, as workers in the zemstvo, working in the cooperative movement. And yet they never wrote about that at all. They left that out because to them, it wasn't the most important part of their lives, perhaps. But that also meant that many historians ignored that very important phase in their life. And it comes up again here as a question because Charushin, even though he firmly believes throughout his life that he was a revolutionary and he was identified as a started revolutionary, as an old revolutionary. And yet, when it came to this debate in the 1980s, his opponents that we'll talk about briefly pointed out the opposite, that in fact, they had become very active. They were bourgeois, they were petty bourgeois. They had given up on their revolutionary commitments. And that kind of issue, which comes up very much. So,
and may I just add to this, just Chairman, and also that's a question when we look at the history of Russian populism, and we pretty often just limit this history of populism to the initial stage, right, to the 1870s or early 80s, and we don't talk about what happened later. So we kind of limit this just the initial stage and ignoring what happened later on in the lives of the Russian revolutionaries. At least they identified themselves as Russian revolutionaries. And also, just one more thing, you can say like Nikolai Charushin, who knew him and why spend so much time talking about one second-tier revolutionary. But the thing is that if you look at books on Russian populism, you can find a lot of quotes from his memoirs. So he was quoted extensively, but at the same time, not as a person. I mean, like his personality and his life was behind his memoirs. His memoirs overshadowed him and his life story. And it was as a source to learn more about Russian populist movement, but not about lives of people who were there.
I realize when you watch TV and there are more than one person on it, the person who's not speaking is supposed to be looking at the other person and admiring what they're saying. So,
yeah, you can do this. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So along that line too, before turning to the 1980s, and this is in the same vein, what we're looking at a generation, we're looking at collective biography, but we're also it's not. When you say that historians tend to ignore populism after this period, that's not entirely true in the sense that, of course, the SR party and the Narodny Socialist, the parties have been given their historians, but we are thinking about populism as a larger mindset. And the vast majority of populists were not belonging to revolutionary parties as such. They were, again, in much more involved in public life as bezpartiyny, where their party affiliation was not seen as central to their identity either. And so that's important. And so we also want to remind you that in recent years, both here and in Russia, writings on populism have tended to focus on the terrorist movement and what was seen as the mindset of religious sectante as being characteristic of its mindset. So we argue instead that it was ethical rationalism, a profoundly moral framework which directed their lives. It's another question what role they saw for violence in bringing about social change and what role the government should play, actually, as their views evolved. But now we should look at the events in Kirov and the participants in the debate about whether the life of this populist Nikolai Charushin should be commemorated.
Yeah, so we look at the case. actually, it was a conflict over the legacy of Nikolai Charushin in Kirov during perestroika time. And we look at this case trying to understand why Charushin's life and his memory became so important and became the center of this conflict in Kirov. So let us tell really briefly this story, how this conflict actually began and why it became such a fuss about legacy of Charushin and his life in Kirov.
I want to interrupt for 1 second there.
Okay.
And because when I was in Kirov, I spent a lot of time there and I started being interested in him. And when I went to give a couple of talks in Yelabuga, etc., people didn't know anything about Nikolai Charushin. And in fact, one time they invited me to give a talk about Charushin, and they expected me to talk about his brother, Ivan, who was a very prominent architect, at least regionally. So it's important to know underneath this that when this question arises, and there's a lot of public debate about it, for many people in Kirov, it was the first they'd ever heard of Nikolai Charushin as well.
Yeah, especially from an American historian, probably it was really interesting to hear about Charushin and Kirov. So the case, we were looking at the case, at the conflict which unfolded during perestroika. And actually kind of the trigger for this conflict was the decision of the local authorities, but you're disappearing from the screen. So for the decision of the local authorities to demolish his house. And it could be just, okay, that's an old house, but and it could just go unnoticed. But the thing was that local, I would say, enthusiasts or bearers of culture, like local historians, librarian, professional historian, they started this campaign that not just the house of Charushin should be demolished, but a memorial plaque should be installed at this place, and actually it should become a kind of a site of memory and to honor Charushin as a revolutionary and as a prominent citizen of Viatka, who contributed a lot to the cultural life and political life. But when we look at this case, we can see how all these debates actually show us the values and also different views, not about the only revolutionary movement in Russia, but also that's about the concept of freedom, democracy, culture, and the idea how the Soviet intelligentsia, I deliberately use this term, the Soviet intelligentsia, because most of our participants in this campaign in the 1988 actually identified themselves as the Soviet intelligentsia, and we could see in their letters and their writings this sort of identity. But the thing is, when they started this campaign, and we have 3 characters here, so let us talk really briefly about these 3 characters, because they became really important in this political, definitely say political campaign about Charushin. So the first one was Alexander Reva. He was a local historian, not a professional one, rather an amateur, we can say graduate. And Alexander Reva wrote a letter trying to defend this Charushin's house and to defend this commemorative plaque at his house that should be installed. But his argumentation, that's what we really want to focus on, because for Alexander Reva, Charushin was a knight, yeah, a рыцарская figura. And that's very interesting how he identified him as a knight, but that's a knight who fought for democracy, for free, perestroika, 1980. So for him, it was definitely a link between what was going on in the Soviet Union during perestroika and this struggle for democracy and freedom. And this political characteristic, it was really important for him. But at the same time, it was a tricky thing how to defend Charushin, given that if you look at his biography, that in 1917, during the Russian Revolution, he didn't support the Bolsheviks regime. Moreover, in his newspaper, because he was a founder of a local newspaper, he actually tried to warn that the Bolsheviks regime can cause more trouble than a common good, and tried to warn against Lenin's action. So and you can think still about the Soviet legacy and the Soviet historiography of that time, and how to defend a political figure who didn't support the Russian Revolution of 1917, who didn't support the Bolsheviks regime, and actually was arrested 4 times after the 1917. And because of that, the arguments were really kind of go around different topics and trying to be careful what should be said and what should be kind of omitted in this argumentation. And another person who was probably a driving force for this political campaign was a local librarian, retired by this time, Gali Chudova, who wrote extensively letters to the local newspaper. Now also, she wrote a letter to professional historians, and I believe you all know these names because she wrote to Nikolai Troitsky, to Boris Ittenberg, trying to involve them in this campaign to defend Charushin's name, Charushin legacy, and kind of refer to their professional reputation, and kind of rely on their weight in this debate. And also what's important that Gali Chudova, for her, the most important thing, what Charushin did, was not his political views, was not his political activity or participation in populist movement. She also kind of noted that he made some mistakes. There were some missteps, referring to the 1917. For her, the most important thing was what Charushin was a librarian, that he contributed to the local cultural life, that he was, for her, he was not this, symbol of democracy and freedom. For her, he was a cultural bearer. He was a typical intelligent, and in this case, for her, was really important to defend him, who did a lot and develop a lot the local culture.
Yeah, and I think my feeling, we argued, didn't argue, but debated about exactly who was Chudova. She was very prominent in Kirov, and I knew that. And the library itself was a center where kraevedi and people who, and artists would still come together and see themselves as bulwarks of civilization in the countryside. So Gali Chudova was a very important figure. But she's also, for a Western eye, she's really quite problematic. Because her language, in late Soviet language, she called herself a true Leninist, and as did Gorbachev, of course. But it's very hard to know exactly, because her father was arrested in 1938, and she mentions that. And she mentions that she's, I'll talk about this in a second, the opponents of Charushin are using the language of 1937, and that really upsets her. For a Westerner observing it, if you think of Yurchak and his writings, Soviet mindset, she's very problematic for us to see what she really did. Did she really believe? She was clearly very intelligent, very ethical, et cetera, et cetera. And we say, how could you be a true Leninist? I mean, that's kind of confusing. So, but of course, the next person was Valentin Sergeyev, and he's very interesting. And I think there's a bit of a connection with Leonid Vyshlenkovic here, because he studied in Kazan and he was the son of teachers. He got a degree, and he started to teach at the Kirov Pedagogical Institute. But his free kind of mindset got him in trouble quite early, and he was forced to leave the Kirov Pedagogical Institute, and he spent 10 to 15 years in Kamchatka teaching there, and then returned during the Perestroika era, taking up jobs at various universities. And he made it very clear he had no use for those who opposed putting up a plaque for Charushin. And as he got involved in this, the letters that he wrote became more and more, I would say, radical and direct and insistent that that Charushin was prophetic in what he saw, which was what Charushin called in English a bacchanalia of violence that was going to be coming. And to me, he died in 1986 at the age of about 60 or so. He was clearly a product of the thaw. His language was very focused on democracy, authentic democracy. It's not clear what he thought exactly about socialism. And he, of course, in his writings called them разночинцы. So he was, but he saw himself, I think, not only as a local figure, but as a professional historian who was similar in his views, we think, to someone like Trotsky and Ittenberg, who enter into this as well. So, all right, do I do Sukhodive?
I can just add to this because we are talking about the whole political campaign and different perspectives and different views, different kind of understanding who Charushin was and why he should be defended, or it should be in opposition to his commemoration and his role in the local life or in political life. They were opponents, and actually that's interesting to see what kind of arguments each side used in this campaign, trying to defend or to fight the role of Charushin there. And as Ben already mentioned, for Chudova, who actually characterized herself as a long-life member of the Communist Party and used all these quotations from Gorbachev's speeches of the perestroika time, talking about the revolutionary renewal in Russia and the Soviet Union of that time. So it was kind of a debate. Who was a real revolutionary, and could be Charushin named a true revolutionary, and if for Chudova or Sergeyev or Reva, there was no doubt that Charushin was a revolutionary to some extent, depending on their position. But at the same time, other people, and we can see here, also historians. So we can see professional historians being involved in this debate, professional historians in the Kirov Pedagogical Institute, who tried to actually dismiss the Charushin case.
Yeah, so that takes us to two historians about who, to be honest, we know a lot less. We don't know about, and in a certain sense, it's unfair because we're not to what extent they were opportunistic or exactly what their true beliefs were. We really don't have any idea. If it's a little bit problematic with the others getting it, but we have much more of an understanding. Both of them, two of them, they're named Sukhodolov and Komarov. They taught at the Pedagogical Institute and were probably among the figures who were responsible back in the 1970s in and forcing Sergeyev to leave. So there was also a kind of personal story here. In addition, the fact that Sukhodolov, they when they came out immediately to oppose in 1988, they're putting a plaque on, and they accused Charushin of being not a revolutionary, even a counter-revolutionary, of being an opportunist, as being a member of the petty bourgeoisie, as of course opposing October, et cetera, et cetera. This was not, they were then accused by Chudova and Sergeyev of using language that came right out of 1937, 1988, and as if they were having access to some NKVD files. But this didn't start in 1988, as I already mentioned, that it's probably started early in the 1970s, this conflict. And I think more interesting in 1976, when Chudova and other Krayevedi, and I use the word Kraeved because it doesn't exist in English. It, like local historian, is not exactly the same. And there was a very strong Kraevedist community in Kirov when I was there. But in 1976, Chudova and a very famous, locally famous Kraeved named Petraev, who is another whole story, a very interesting figure, they had organized a chitania at the library to discuss the cultural contribution of Nikolai Charushin, and who was listed not as a revolutionary, not as a counter-revolutionary, I've forgotten, as a local Kraeved and librarian. That's how it was. And at that point, Sukhadoyev had written to the local Communist Party authorities, pointing out that they were trying to introduce into the public a counter-revolutionary, and that they should be reprimanded for doing that, and in the evening should be canceled. At which stage, a fairly locally very prominent historian, Amanutsky, stood up and said, "Where's your evidence, Sukhadoyev?" And they backed off. But that was indication that, in other words, that this tension that emerged in 1988 had underlined the culture for much longer than that. That it wasn't simply caused by perestroika; it was just brought out at that point. And we don't know. I mean, it's easy to label both Sukhadoyev and Komarov as opportunists, or even worse, true believers in Stalinism. We just don't know exactly how that, but they were certainly not respected within this particular community.
Yeah, yes, just one more thing. Like for them, why Charushin couldn't be a true revolutionary? Like, yes, he was arrested, but later on, he became like a professional photographer. He became an insurance agent. That's not, that can fit to kind of a biography of a true revolutionary. So because of that, he cannot be counted, he cannot be characterized or identified as a true revolutionary.
That brings up, this is not really totally relevant, but something, Tatiana's working a lot on the history of photography right now, and Charushin was a photographer, and he was, his works were quite well known, are still quite easily available online now, where he actually examined, where he photographed very extensively both landscape, but also peoples of Mongolia, etc., the indigenous population. And it was this is an aside, I realize it was very interesting because he used the vocabulary of a colonial, kind of a colonial gaze, and never, while he was a true populist, he never connected the indigenous peoples of Siberia or Mongolia to the term narod. That simply didn't exist in his vocabulary. So that was kind of, we're focusing on his ethical commitments at the center of this, but there were many, many other interesting things that come out about the mindset. So,
so if we look at this case once again, and trying to think what was at stake, why this political debate brought many people to discuss Charushin legacy and his biography and the concept of a true revolutionary, or we can talk about the concept of the revolution itself, speaking of populism in Russia. And once again, it was the I think it's really important to think how populism as a movement was pictured in the historiography, and how professional historians, but also public, how they look at populism and the history of the Russian revolutionary movement, and think about what was the core, what was the value, what was the morale, and how they can understand this movement going beyond just ideological statement. And we think that what was actually the core for this debate, that they saw, I mean, when we try to go beyond these ideological characteristics or ideological classification, because what we can see, and you're familiar with the historiography, how populism kind of classified and just, put in different segments, and we have all these strict characteristics and different directions. And I think it did even more harm to the history of populism than all these campaigns calling populists the enemies of the Marxism or whatever, because we have this kind of dry out classification where we don't see real people with their values, their struggles, their different views, and also what we can see at the core of the populist movement. And once again, we want to bring these two concepts, the concept of authenticity and why we want to refer podlinnost to Lydia Ginsburg for why the Soviet Intelligentsia took these cases and actually fight all these cases because they saw this authenticity and the idea how the words and the deeds actually could be the same. And here we are going to the debate about especially the late Soviet time, and we can remind about the famous work by Alexei Yurchak, and think about how the Soviet intelligentsia tried to find something real, authentical in populist views and populist ethics, and take these as relevant to their own lives and experience.
Yeah. So in that sense, the least interesting question here is whether or not he was a true revolutionary. It's much more, again, getting into also. We didn't mention that Chudova, when she was raising the campaign, a letter campaign to support putting the plaque, she turned to outside historians such as Troitsky and Ittenberg from Saratov and from Moscow. I said so. To, pardon?
I said it.
Yeah, you already said that. She says you already said it. Okay, so, but I think those of you who have had a chance to look at our book, and you may wonder why we're going over something that was in that book, because we're actually, and one of the reasons was that in the reviews we got in the West, they were all extremely positive, but never mentioned this chapter. And it was, which we're thinking about rewriting it in another context. And our larger question too is exactly what is the understanding of the term populism, both in the West and in Russia today. And in my view, there's really no relation. In the word, we should be talking about narodnichestvo, because there's almost nothing in common between the movements. This is this whole focus on pretty largely on terrorism, and on these questions of whether they were predecessors of the Bolsheviks or whatever, and then also the fact that the emphasis on populism as strictly a movement of political parties like the SRs leaves out the fact that that the mindset itself was extraordinarily widespread among the Russian intelligentsia of the late 19th and the early 20th century. And again, how this link between professional historians working on in one dimension in the 1960s and later, and what Tatiana was just talking about, this much wider public that showed an interest in the lives of these figures for different reasons. Again, for this kind of, for people who combined, that were always aware of the need to or make their words and their actions fit. Obviously not a characteristic of Soviet era politicians or American politicians for that point, of course. But there was a particular contradiction felt in in the late Soviet period, and awareness that Yurchak talks about as well. And I should say too, there's a presentism to our own interests because of what's happened in our own country, et cetera, in recent years. And we are trying to figure out how to integrate this story into a larger story of populism and a global or comparative platform.
Yeah, and just kind of wrapping this up, actually this case also, it kind of brings us to think and maybe even to re-examine the history of populism, focusing not so much on ideological statements, constellations, but more on the concept of ethical rationalism, and also trying to expand history of the Russian populism and going beyond just the certain events like political movement to the people or terrorist acts, and see how this mindset, how this ethic, because definitely we should talk about the certain morality or ethic of the Russian revolutionaries, and specifically the Russian populists or Narodniki, how it can help actually us to re-examine the history of the Russian intelligentsia, and also we believe it might help us to understand better the history of the Soviet intelligentsia, to link this history with the history of the Russian revolutionary movement of the 19th century. I think we can.
So we're very interested, we have a bit of a time, we're very interested in your suggestions about, we welcome your criticism as well, but we're very interested in suggestions how this could be expanded, and particularly how this chapter could be rewritten and expanded. We're also, we mentioned Charushin's brother, Ivan, but he had a second, he had another, there were 7 people in his family, but his other brother, Arkady, was a high-ranking bureaucrat working on land resettlement, et cetera. And the 3 of them maintained close contact throughout their lives and supported each other at very difficult moments in their lives. So you have a chinovnik, you have a prominent architect who really didn't seem to have, he was very successful in late imperial Russia, but he also was very successful as an architect in the 20s and 30s. And then a revolutionary who, that also is something that we have as part of the, I don't know if you want to say it, the infrastructure or the architecture of what we're trying to.
But now you're trying to switch the focus, right?
No,
because you're kind of trying to.
I'm trying to suggest how we're doing more research on that right now. We've found a lot more biographic material, and so this folds into it, trying to get a collective mindset.
Yeah, but also I think that's really important, and we need to think about this. That's not a suggestion to re-examine or revive the history of the Russian populism, but I think it should be bring to the kind of the discussion among historians how we can study populism, because we still operate and we still use this old kind of classifications or conceptions of Russian populism, and we pretty often we can see how populism as a movement and as a large part of the Russian history kind of maybe not forgotten or not misinterpreted, I don't want to claim this, but kind of neglected and not, some light definitely should be laid on this movement, and probably it should be brought back to the Russian history and re-examine. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm stopping here.
Thank you for your presentation. And now we have time for short questions, if there are any.
Да, вы можете отвечать на английском, а я задам вопрос на русском. А вот это Галина Чудова, она является библиотекарем, как я понимаю, да? И для нее Чарушин — это такая история корпорации, да, вот библиотечной такой профессии и так далее. И ну вот этот вот такое вот направление, такой коммеморация, ну как бы встраивание вот в эту профессию, оно у нее в книгу воплотилось или какие-то таблички, может быть, какая-нибудь там аудитория в библиотеке, там зала имени Чарушина. Во что это, как бы, в какие формы?
Я, наверное, могу начать, да, Бен? Здесь очень важно, что для нее он, конечно, библиотекарь и больше, чем библиотекарь, потому что здесь вопрос о том, как она сама, как мне кажется, из того, что мы читали, потому что она оставила воспоминания, не опубликованные.
Ужасные.
Ужасные, да? Ну, в смысле, написанные очень таким...
Почти все воспоминания ужасные.
Нет, в том смысле, что они очень, очень официальные, то есть очень неживые, то есть все, что как бы такие очень фасадные, да, можно сказать, воспоминания, где очень сложно понять, где там живой как бы человек и живой опыт. Но дело в том, что мне кажется, что она видела Чарушина не просто как библиотекаря, а как вот просветителя, да, и как вот интеллигента, да, с которым она соединяла, что это больше, чем библиотекарь. Это как вот поэт в России больше, чем поэт, библиотекарь – это больше, чем библиотекарь, да. Это вот местный просветитель, это центр культурной жизни, библиотека. И для нее это было важно, потому что мне еще кажется, что это был способ уйти от политических оценок Чарушина, потому что она все равно не могла принять, что он не принял революцию, что он не поддержал Ленина и большевиков. И для нее это был способ как бы оставить в сторону одни характеристики и сосредоточиться на других. Да,
нейтрализовать, да? Такую
да,
вот
да, сбалансировать, как бы найти своего Чарушина, да, и создать вот тот образ, который ей был важен. И она на самом деле в плане коммеморации, она сделала, ну, я считаю, что это было просто подвиг библиотечный, потому что Чарушин, когда он начал работать в библиотеке, он стал составлять указатель библиографический, и она фактически его закончила. То есть она вот такой способ коммеморации, да, когда она продолжила его работу. Вот. Но она также опубликовала статью о нем в советской библиографии, в журнале, организовывала вот эти чтения в память его. Но очень было интересно, как она я не могу сказать, что она лавировала. Мне кажется, она выбирала, какого Чарушина она создавала, да, какого она видела, и что для нее в нем было важно. Да, та как раз сердцевина. Но портрет Чарушина висел в библиотеке, мне Бен рассказывал.
Отлично.
The portrait of Charushin, his picture, was in the reading room in the Kirov library, right?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for this really interesting presentation. And I guess I have a comment and a question. And the comment is this. This is Larry. Not Larry. Excuse me. This is to the point earlier about Ben. This is to your point about how to make populism, how to connect it to present day questions and concerns. And it strikes me that a thing that's, and here I'm going by the book that the two of you have written about Charushin, that one of the main points that you make about him is his active involvement in local civil society in Viatka. And clearly, one of the huge problems, at least in the West, certainly in the United States today, and I think in Russia also, is the weakness of local civil society, of local civil societies as mediators between the population and powerful national or global institutions. And I think if you look at a lot of what fuels the right-wing populist movements in our own time is a frustration by populations with big national and international structures. And so, and the Bolsheviks, I think, represented a similar tendency to create powerful national structures that ignored local concerns, so that people who take these local concerns seriously, I think, have a lot to tell us today. I mean, that's just the comment I wanted to give. The question I have is when you're talking about the debate in Kirov in the late 1980s, and you make reference to their discussions about, who is using the language of 1937 and who was a real revolutionary or not a real revolutionary, these things. How much of that is a theoretical and historical discussion, that is, that people read in books about 1937? And how much is this a living memory, that people either personally remember things or their parents remember things, these things are still being talked about? Do you see my question? How much of this is a living continuity, and how does that work? And how much of it is that people are discussing in theoretical terms that they have learned abstractly?
So,
and Ben, I'm sorry I gave you the wrong name before. It's Larry is right next to you on my screen. So Larry Holmes. And so these names are getting jumbled in my head. Sorry about that.
So good. Those are really great comments. And I think this, we could go, I was, as a total outsider, like Larry Holmes, being immersed in Kirov society, in Viatka society. And I was fascinated by how strong the Kraevedchik community is. And of course, Viatka, in a sense, was had a very rich history in terms of producing revolutionaries. It's astounding how many came out of that region. So there was a connection there. With Sergeyev, his family were clearly, he saw historical links between his parents and his grandparents, who were teachers and populists and all of that. That's all there somewhere. It was interesting, though, that when I met his son, who was a historian also is an historian in Kirov at the Pedagogical Institute, but has kind of given up research and is now an administrator. And when I met him, he handed me the Sergeyev's kind of what existed as memoirs, which weren't terribly helpful to us. But he insisted that his father was not a shestidesiatnik. It just was not the case. And he didn't want to talk about it any further. That was it. And so related to that, I found that we mentioned Chudova's memoirs and how uninformative they were in many ways. And I think it was a characteristic in some ways of that generation. I read also Sergeyev's mentor, Wolfson, in Kirov, who published his memoirs, but they were very disappointing compared to what I learned about the colorful and very vibrant nature of their intellectual worlds and their personal worlds. And I think there was something about this generation too that made writing memoirs that combined the personal and the political. That was a very hard leap. So I had one other thing to say, but I'll wait on that. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I think this connection between the local and the national scale, right? And what you mentioned as intermediaries and how we can see this local civil society institution or local agents of the civil society. I think that's a great point. And I actually what made, I think it kind of speaks to this talk about Charushin's legacy and the campaign, because what made Charushin really important and relevant for these people, that his participation in the local life. So they didn't take him as much as a revolutionary at the national scale, as the Tchaikovsky Circle member or, the Russian populist, whatever. For them in Kirov, it was important what he did for Kirov, for the local society, how he was working for the local society, and for the living memory, especially for the language of 1937. That's a good question. That's the thing when, for example, Sukhadoev and Komarov, when they wrote these letters and they accused Charushin to be an enemy of the people. So they used this kind of, language and references, but also immediately how for Chudova, it was like, yeah, that's a signal. That's kind of a marker of that time, and she could identify these kind of Stalinist views immediately. But I think that's a good way to look at this through the living memory and the kind of way, you know, how it's transmitted and how it's transferred from one generation to another, and how we can take this. Yeah, I would rather think more about this question. Thank you.
I want to add one more thing. I'm sorry. So you make a comparison, Alex, and I've been doing quite a bit of reading about populism globally, and making what are the key features. And there are two aspects that are brought up about global populism that don't apply, very clearly don't apply to Russian populism. And one was the presence of charismatic leaders. In fact, of course, populism, people criticize Chernov for being completely uncharismatic and hurting the SR party. And the other is what anthropologists say about global populism, is that it is what they say thin on doctrine. There's not really much discussion actually of policy, thin on policy. Whereas that wasn't, even though we focus on the ethical, rational commitment, it's very clear that there was an ongoing concern, both in the revolutionary movement and then populist and civil society, about very key things like the role of the state, about redistribution of land. Those we shouldn't ignore. One final thing is like trying to look out and fit this into a larger discussion about global populism. I discovered that, the focus by historians has been on terrorism and then this religious sectanstva, but actually in Russia, in the early post-Soviet period, there was an outpouring of interest in neo-populism, and particularly in the whole notion of decentralization, местное самоуправление, which, and there was a lot of writing about it in the 1990s in Russia, because obviously with Yeltsin and federalism, that became a very important kind of topic to study. So that has to be added to the kind of historiographical kind of viewing.
And I would just add that, speaking of terms, right, like every time now when I look at some announcement talks about populism, right, especially here in the States, and then realize, yeah, that's about right-wing populism, right? That's not about that populism, that's about this populism. So the term itself, it's now so confusing. And also we realized quite recently that we have different understanding. I mean, Ben and I, we used a term neo-populism in different sense, because I referred to the Russian historiographical tradition of using this term neo-populism, and Ben was mostly kind of thinking about more Western approach to neo-populism. So we're dealing here with different terms and different meanings and different historiographical traditions as well.
My question is about fate of this late Soviet intelligence, that intelligentsia that you have mentioned in your presentation. Vladislav Zubok stated that perestroika was a kind of swan song of the generation of the Thaw, these leftists who fashioned themselves after their 19th century predecessors. And I was wondering whether the movement really faded out in the 90s, or they managed somehow to continue to spread and to advocate their identity and their ethical views, maybe in a modified form. So that's my question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I would say that, I mean, if you think about different generations, and especially when we use this generational approach and try to kind of, map this history of the Soviet intelligentsia in generational terms, of course, we're dealing with different approaches, right? Either we think about generations as imagined communities, as symbolic communities, or we think about generations as real communities, as like age cohort or whatever. So giving all these different approaches in generational studies. So, and I think, first thing that, if you think about the generation of the 60s or generation of the Thaw, I mean, as a real cohort, by the 1990s, if you look at the age, I mean, they kind of almost, out from the political scene, right? And it's mostly a symbolic community, kind of a point of reference, which is constructed and reconstructed again, and has been used as this reference point. And also, that's interesting, as Ben mentioned, like Sergeyev's son insisted that Sergeyev wasn't, he didn't belong with generation of the 60s. So with different understanding, but for me, it's more like a symbolic legacy, right? How we use this symbolic community for the current political debates, rather than a real kind of generational voice being present at the political scene at that time. Ben? That's first time when he just agreed with me.
During the whole presentation, by the way, very good presentation, thank you very much. I've been thinking about this problem about intelligence. Like, I see that intelligentsia is not an instituted community. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Do you hear me? Because
yeah.
I froze for the second. Just I have a bad connection, I think. I see that intelligentsia is not an instituted identity in the history of the Russia. And there is the problem how to localize intelligentsia, because as you can see, your individuals like Chudova, they were thinking about themselves as an intelligentsia movement. And maybe, for example, the dissidents movement, who also thought about themselves as intelligentsia, maybe become the part of this story if we are talking about the intelligent movement.
Well, I thought...
Is it okay?
When that's a very interesting question, and I thought when I was thinking about, again, about Sergeyev and his son, the fact that he did not want his father to be considered a dissident. And I think he used the two words in a certain way at the same time, shistideshatnik and dissident, and that's not that's obviously not accurate. But there was that. I couldn't find. I searched very hard. I couldn't find any of the surviving letters that were written during this whole year in which this debate took place. We didn't mention it was the initial letter came in the papers, in the newspaper, and then there was a silent. There was no decision made by the local authorities for a year, but they welcomed letters, and I was really excited. But I went to the archives, and they just could not be found, whether they were just not being made access. So it was. I was really trying to get at your question too. I think if I understood you, I'm sorry, my hearing is not so good. Looking at a broader sampling of the local population at that time who considered themselves educated and who wrote letters would have been much more informative about kind of clarifying that.
Yeah, I can just chime in. It's actually, that's a risky ground when we go into debate about the Russian intelligentsia, right? And I think I can see Andrei smiling at this point, because that's a whole field, right? All these debates, who belong, who didn't belong, and how we understand the term itself. So that's a long-standing tradition, right? To trying to identify or how this term should be used, like going back to the 19th century and the 20th century. And of course, we can look at the intelligentsia as a social grouping, right? And also we can look at the intelligentsia as a discourse, right? And we can use just different approaches and different tools when we examine that. I don't like this word, the phenomenon of the Russian intelligentsia, because actually we can see different national versions the intellectual communities in different countries. So that's a long story, right? And that's kind of a long tradition of studying intelligentsia and trying to define intelligentsia or intelligentsia versus intellectuals, and in different cultural and national milieu, when we can see that. But I think what we use, because we, of course, we thought how we can use this term and how we can deploy this term to these people we studying. And for us, I think that the most important thing was self-identification. So that's not about institutions. That's not about official voices, right? Right, the way trying to create this kind of the formal representation of the intelligentsia, but that's about self-identification, how they identified themselves. And for us, it was kind of the main criteria in this case.
So if I can add one thing to that, we had something of a disagreement. I was very influenced by an article, I've forgotten the author, came out in the in the early aught, as we say, in like 2000 or so. And the argument was actually a sociological one rather than that, in the sense that this author's argument was that when you talk about the late Soviet intelligentsia, you have to be aware that there was a huge difference between the capital cities and the provinces or the regions. And his argument was that in a city like Kirov, which was a closed city, and it was very involved in the defense industry and military, aviation in particular, but not only, that that roughly 2/3 of the so-called intelligentsia were engineers by training, and many of them, particularly in these closed cities, had no access whatsoever to Western discourse, never mind access to, formal sociological studies of their own country and or any of those. But I think Tatiana's perspective was that that's overstated, because, for example, you were in Omsk, right? And
You disappeared.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to add that was one point. I guess since I still have the stage, I should also say that in general, in terms of the importance of this topic, Tatiana and I gave a talk at it was Columbia, right? New York University, and when our book first came out, and the host was someone most of you know, Yanni Katsonos. Yanni Katsonos, who wrote this book, what's it in Russian? It's Making Peasants Backwards. Mm-hmm. And his question to us was, why are you studying this topic? They were losers. They lost, so they're of no importance whatsoever. And I think he was just trying to be provocative in a good sense to get a debate going. But
yeah, so I'm just thinking that when you use this term intelligentsia, I mean, in most cases, it can be just instrumental, because that's not about trying to reconstruct the whole story, right? But how you can deploy this term and for what purpose you can use this term in your own studies, in your own research. I think that's kind of the most important angle.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, since there's a little bit of a silence, and I also wanted to bring up another post-Soviet Russian historian, Gelman. He's actually a sociologist, I think, because they not who, and in his book about this time, his argument was that there was a radical difference generationally between the Шестидесятники and the 70s, 1970s generation described by Yurchak. And he argued that Gelman, that the Шестидесятники, they were not prepared for the collapse of the Soviet Union because they had focused entirely, and their awareness was on democratizing Russia, but their understanding of their own society was very, very limited because they didn't have access to sociology, et cetera, et cetera. But that the 70s generation we're not so interested in democracy in the abstract. And for that reason, we're much better prepared to deal with the collapse of the Soviet Union because they were much more instrumental in their understanding of their society. And I'm not sure, when we look at this debate in the 1980s, when you have this kind of, these stereotypical descriptions of two generations, which themselves are constructs. There are constructs because, as Tatiana was mentioning, how you can plug those debates into this picture that we were depicting here, because we don't discuss that really. For further writing, that's kind of a direction we think we want to go to.
Я взяла с собой вашу книгу, вот лежит на столе. Не то, чтобы она у меня всегда лежит на столе, но к сегодняшнему дню я ее принесла, достала из шкафа.
Спасибо, вот. Лена.
Да, в Зуме, когда всегда книги под рукой из домашней библиотеки. Очень удобно. И мне нравится ваша книга своим построением, ну, не знаю, какой-то вот такой... Мне кажется, не только теоретически, но и интуитивно найденной такой тональностью, вот как показать исторического человека, да, вот чтобы он не растворился в процессах, и это не была история процессов, одновременно, чтобы история не распалась на атомы и на отдельные биографии отдельных людей. И вот как мы можем... Ну и сейчас вы это проблематизируете. Как мы можем работать с разными видами группности? Вот как эти группности создаются, как они распадаются, образуются новые, как эти группы сами о себе думают, как о них думают другие группы. Это вот такое широкое полотно. Вы сейчас поставили столько вопросов в этой презентации, что я думаю, вау, ваша 10-я глава в этой книге «В поисках настоящего Чарушина» грозит перерасти в большую-большую книгу, где будут изучаться поиски разных групп людей, уже 20 век, 21 век, как они себе мыслят. И на самом деле мы недавно столкнулись вот в школе исторических наук с вашей тематикой. Потому что поступал, скажем так, в аспирантуру молодой человек, и который сказал, что он будет изучать образы народника в советское там вот время. Все как-то так сели, насторожились и сказали, какие образы? Вот. И дальше он спровоцировал большую дискуссию, все спорили между собой, вот можно эту тему изучать, и есть ли один образ народника, или это много разных образов, да. И понятно, что мы можем там изучать, например, учебники, и это будет некий такой нормативный какой-то вот образ, и там есть конвенции, которые существуют какое-то время, потом они пересматриваются, меняются, да. Но вы в этом смысле замахиваетесь на еще большее. Это выход за такое нормативное знание, но и вот посмотреть, как создаются вот эти представления, как они существуют в профессиональной среде, за профессиональной среде, локальных людей, которые как бы видят, создают, скажем так, мифологию, может быть, своего места, да. Раньше это как-то называлось краеведение, но сейчас исследования в области краеведения показали, что это все не так просто с краеведением, поэтому я уже боюсь пользоваться этим словом. Сразу выводится идея циркуля и где это место, которое является историей края, с какими сантиметрами измеряется. В общем, меня ваше исследование совершенно завораживает, и мне кажется, это выход на много-много тем. Это и политика памяти, и это конструирование группности. Одновременно видно, что вы сами... Наверное, вам тоже не просто во всем этом. потому что я знаю, что Татьяна много и успешно занималась конструированием поколений, а сейчас вы как бы говорите, оперируете этими понятиями, как само собой разумеющимися, типа вот есть поколение такое, есть поколение такое. Я думаю, что в процессе исследования эти границы тоже как бы будут опять проблематизированы. И у вас вот за что ни возьмись, везде проблемы. И как бы вот, и когда Татьяна спросила, а как мы можем исследовать там популизм? Вот точно не знаю. Вот вообще понятия не имею, даже вот представления нет, даже предложения никакого вам не могу сделать. Вот буду ждать их от вас, ваших догадок, ваших решений. И очень здорово, что вы берете вот такую личность, как-то очень красивую, у которой есть вот такие, сохранились источники, и в то же время хорошо, что она, ну, Чарушин не был как бы вот таким петербургским или там московским абсолютно интеллигентом, и не был закрыт вот в этих границах локальности, а его биография – это вот такая широкая, поэтому желающих как-то присвоить это прошлое или приватизировать, или как-то его сделать удобным, становится очень много. Поэтому объектом вашего исследования оказывается весь Советский Союз и постсоветская Россия.
Ой, Лен, спасибо огромное. Просто замечательное, не просто заключение, да, а скорее так выход на новое, открытие новых полей и проблематизация, да, того, что было сказано.
Это все мы, провокаторы.
Да, мы старались. Нет, я просто хочу сказать, что мне кажется очень важным, что здесь мы не просто, да, оперируем понятиями, мы действительно возвращаемся, да, как в классическом понимании, да, к истории понятий, и которыми мы оперируем, да, и постоянно их переосмысляем в процессе собственного исследования. Но что мне кажется вот очень важно, да, вот такую как бы не точку поставить, но актуализировать, что когда мы говорим, да, о народниках, и вот эта идея соединить разные, да, условно поколения, разные периоды и посмотреть, с одной стороны, образы или конвенции, да, которые создавались, или какие-то общие ценности, которые разделялись, и которые становились вот этой площадкой как раз для конструирования вот этих общностей, да, которые создавали вот эти символические сообщества, да, и позволяли строить эти символические, и как бы мобилизировать эти символические сообщества, да, и когда мы тогда протягиваем вот эту ниточку из 19 века через 20, да, и пытаемся понять, как на каждом этапе какие-то идеи, какие-то ценности актуализировались, присваивались, переосмыслялись, переинтерпретировались, да, и становились вновь актуальны. А какие уходили на периферию, да, потом снова перемещались с периферии вот в центр и становились актуальными.
И вот не случайно вы делаете свой доклад в Центре университетских исследований Высшей школы экономики, потому что вот вы, может быть, даже не знаете, а вот Алексей Плешков, директор нашего института, и Андрей Ильин, который сейчас вот возглавляет, по сути, проект, там, ну, руководит, они сейчас активно занимаются как раз добродетелями. Да, вот приветствую, Алексей. Добродетелями, этическими ценностями, каким образом вот как бы этические ценности создают вот эти формы группности, где можно вот эти границы разделения между своими и не своими, пересмотр, инвентаризацию и так далее проводить. Так что вот у нас тут вот...
Да, и мне кажется, вот этот случай как раз про историков в Кировском пединституте, да, которые столкнулись и представляли два совершенно разных, причем и этических, да, здесь не только как бы профессиональных или политических, но два разных этических таких вот, две разных этических позиции, да, это тоже очень как раз интересный кейс. Бен, ты что-то хочешь сказать?
Именно.
Ну.
Да, и тут вот книга, посвященная, интереснейшая книга, посвященная Кировскому пединституту, которую Бен нам всячески, да, рекламировал, пересылал, о ней рассказывал. Это как раз вот тоже история неинституциональная, ну такой неоинституционализм, да, когда вот история институция через человеческие взаимоотношения, и что там есть уставы и нормативы одни, а потом все взаимоотношения оказываются другими, и люди могут в пределах как бы каких-то границ, но действовать, варьировать, это, конечно, тоже блестяще просто.
So, yeah, and just about Larry Holmes's work, by the way, he also wrote a book on the evacuatia with very similar features, and it fits into our conversation just because it also involved a public reaction to historical events in the regions. That's very interesting to follow. The last thing, I think Tatiana really has to go. Andrei, I want to thank you, but also tell you that we haven't forgotten about Bakunin. He was important, very important. So this does not, there's no противоречие there at all, okay?
Андрей, я буду рада поговорить про Бакунина отдельно, если хотите, потому что там была очень интересная дискуссия про лавристов и бакунистов и как выходить за рамки вот этого разделения на лавристов и бакунистов в истории народничества.
Вы имеете в виду дискуссия среди историков?
Среди народников самих. То есть это к вопросу о самоидентификации, бакунисты мы или лавристы, и какую роль играл как раз вот эти политические классификации. Потому что мы, понимаете, мы же старались говорить о том, что народники сами очень много сделали для того, чтобы их воспринимали именно такими. Да? Вот эта борьба за собственное наследие и стремление создать свой собственный образ, и причем создать правильный образ, да? Отредактированный образ, и который потом будет оказывать влияние, это же тоже была одна из задач. Сколько Фигнер сделал для того, чтобы все написали правильные биографии, да? Чтобы автобиографии отвечали тому образу, который должен был быть создан. В этом смысле это была целая как раз вот та самая политика памяти, да, которая...
И что Корнилов Мороз сказал, что...
Ну нет, но то, что там действительно очень интересные дебаты по поводу той политики памяти, да, которые были.